morning and welcome to the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. Over the last 2 years, the Select Committee has examined closely how the U.S. can fight climate change and improve our energy security. But we are not in this fight alone, and the progress that our country can make is deeply dependent on the progress that developing countries are making. That is the focus of today's hearing, to take an assessment based on the facts that exist in 2009, not as they existed 5 or 10 years ago, of steps taken by the key developing countries to address global warming. This inquiry is important because Americans rightly want to know that they are not the only ones altering their policies to combat global warming. This inquiry is also important because many members have rightly expressed concern about maintaining the competitiveness of critical industry sectors, and they want to know that other countries are joining the fight and requiring their industries to move away from business as usual. A discussion on what developing countries are doing needs to be fueled by current facts and not by old perceptions. One old perception is that China is unwilling to join the fight against climate change and is wedded to growth at any cost. A current reality is that China has already adopted an energy efficiency law that far exceeds anything on the law books of our country. Other examples abound of how developing countries are making progress. I am not suggesting that the developing countries are doing everything they can do, and they are certainly not doing everything that needs to be done. But as we undertake climate change legislation in our country, we should understand the steps taken by key developing countries around the world. China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa are some of the biggest emitters of the developing world. Over the last years, all of these countries have displayed an increasing awareness of the need to act. Just last week, President Obama acknowledged China in his speech to the joint session of Congress for having launched the largest effort in history to make their economy energy efficient. Also last week, Greenpeace welcomed India's National Climate Plan's first step, a market mechanism that could phase out 400 million incandescent bulbs by 2012. In December last year, Mexico set an aspirational target to cut in half its 2002 carbon emissions by 2050. And the Brazilian government released its National Plan on Climate Change. These are encouraging signs of action. But the world has to do more, and the world has to act together. Despite the action and efforts shown around the world, emissions continue to rise. We have to reverse this trend, and certainly developed countries will have to show clear commitment and live up to their promises, and developing countries will need to support when accelerating their action. To ensure that the world achieves the needed reductions, we need a strong agreement in Copenhagen. And we need to monitor and verify the efforts all across the world. We need to be sure that promises lead to action, that plans get implemented, that results live up to expectations. The United States must show that it will lead this effort. Only by doing so, we will collectively be able to win the fight against dangerous climate change. Let me turn now and recognize the ranking member of the Select Committee, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Well, thank you very much. I guess the cash register is on this side of the aisle, because last week we learned how expensive our response to climate change is going to be. President Obama's budget blueprint established potential domestic costs, and today's hearing will highlight the mounting international demands. The world is expecting increased energy efficiency from the developing world, and the developing world is demanding compensation in return. We've known for a while that the cap and tax policy, which is my name for the carbon trading system President Obama is advocating, will significantly harm the U.S. economy. In his budget blueprint last week, President Obama sketched out a cap and tax plan that will require approximately $80 billion a year from U.S. taxpayers. By 2020, Americans will have paid $646 billion to fund this scheme. And while $646 billion is a shocking number, or at least it used to be, it pales in comparison to the demands of developing countries. India's government stated that the developed nations owe billions of dollars to developing nations to compensate for climate change. In its submission to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Indian government argued that this funding should be a legal obligation for developed countries that cannot be subject to the decisions of developed country governments or legislatures. How that flies in the face of our Constitution's requirement that nothing be paid out of the Treasury except by appropriation, I don't know. They added that this funding should not be in the form of loans and that the providers of finance cannot be discretionary donors but must be legally obligated assessees. In its own submission, China argued that the developed nations should provide new, additional, adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding of at least 0.5 to 1% of a nation's GDP over and above existing foreign aid. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change, a supporter of cap and tax policies, estimated that welfare costs to developed countries could be over $400 billion per year in 2020, rising to over $3 trillion per year in 2050. And over $1 trillion of this would come from the United States. As the MIT study notes, this scheme goes well beyond compensating for mitigating costs and turns the mitigation policy into an instrument for global income redistribution, unquote. Several developing countries have made efforts to increase their energy efficiency, which is good. But many of these countries have publicly stated their good intentions and aspirational goals to reduce their emissions, but it is their willingness and ability to actually implement these policies that will determine the ultimate success of our global efforts. China has already resisted enforcement of WTO's trade rules. The U.S. Trade Representative found in its 2008 report to Congress on China's WTO compliance that, quote, China has yet to fully implement important commitments, and in other areas significant questions have arisen regarding China's adherence to ongoing WTO obligations, including core WTO principles. In my role as a member and former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I sure have found that out due to the lack of enforcement by China of intellectual property rights laws, even though the Chinese law on the books looks as good as the United States' law or the laws that are in the European Union. A post-Kyoto treaty cannot succeed without China's participation, but can we expect China's compliance with the climate change treaty given its history with the WTO? I think the answer is obvious. Today's witness, Lee Lane, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, rightly recognizes that technological development is the crucial long-term priority. Politics is the art of the possible, but current proposals for emissions reductions go beyond not only what's politically possible, but also what's actually achievable. Nations cannot afford to meet greenhouse gas reduction goals without substantial advances in energy technology. The development of technology, not higher taxes or global wealth redistribution schemes, should be where Congress focuses its efforts to confront climate change. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning more about what role technology can play in these important climate change negotiations leading to the UN Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen this December. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this opportunity. Mr. Chairman, I'm absolutely convinced that the American economy can be retooled to meet the challenge of climate change, and that the second industrial revolution of this country can be a revolution that would green our economy in more ways than one. But I think that we are really in a unique position, maybe even an awkward position, because of the last decade, almost a decade of ignoring the science of climate change. And we are faced now with an opportunity for the President to go to Copenhagen in December of this year. And I think that in Copenhagen, the President is going to be watched and listened to perhaps in a more more serious way than maybe ever a president or an American official has dealt with this issue of climate change. And so I'm interested in hearing from the panel the things you think we must do before Copenhagen, before next December, in order to have credibility when the president speaks on the last day of the conference. So I appreciate your presence. I hope to be able to probe your considerable knowledge of the subject in order to ascertain information that will be helpful as this committee continues to study this issue and make recommendations to the Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and also for our panel of witnesses today. The world is on the cusp of exciting developments. Following the Bali meetings, a framework for negotiations developing which could lead to the first real international climate change effort. At least that's my hope for the Copenhagen meetings. An international agreement must have enforceable targets. It must take care to rein in irresponsible practices by developing countries, particularly China and India. But we must realize that while large and growing, these nations have much lower standards of living than ours, and we need to be sympathetic to their desire to achieve what we in this country have been calling the American dream for more than 2 centuries. At the same time, our economy is suffering, and manufacturing is on the decline here at home. Any climate legislation that this Congress considers need to take into account the impact it will have on people and businesses in the United States. So there are twin challenges. How do we get China and India and the developing world to agree to climate change goals that do not stifle their own growth? And how do we limit our own contribution of greenhouse gases without further crippling the United States economy? I believe in that answer we can find opportunity. American businesses can lead the way in renewable and energy-efficient technology. For example, just last week we had several witnesses testify about the work their companies are doing on energy efficiency and smart growth technology. In the Hudson Valley of New York, we have innovators working on waste to energy, solar, biomass, and investors looking to fund renewable projects, and such low-tech solutions as weatherization, which would hopefully capture the 30 to 40% heat loss or air conditioning loss, as the case may be, from individual homes. And we, in our stimulus recovery package, passed a large enough amount that New York State this year will be receiving about twice for weatherization what the entire country received last year. And a proportionate effort is being made nationwide. It's a serious conservation effort, and I'm very proud of it, and proud of the fact that my county, Dutchess County, will be hiring 5 times as many work crews to go out and do insulation, storm doors, storm windows, weather stripping. We're not talking high-tech new inventions. We're talking basic good building practices to save energy and save those homeowners money. It's time to harness our ingenuity to solve the climate crisis and export manufactured goods once again. We can fuel the carbon-efficient global economy with just a little bit of investment. The economic stimulus was a good start, but more can be done, and if we do that, we can help the developing countries meet their targets, make the planet a better place, and make some money or save some money for our people at the same time. We should not be afraid of this challenge. We should welcome it. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Salazar.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here with you today and with you and Mr. Sensenbrenner. I share some of the same values as you do. I come from the Colorado San Luis Valley, which is very rich in solar. We have a 150-day average of sunshine in Colorado. And I believe that, you know, in renewable energy and the world's need for energy conservation and development of renewable sources of energy, I think that the world has a real need for some type of moderate, common sense legislation and talks and negotiations to move, you know, our climate change issues to the forefront. I also share the concerns of Mr. Sensenbrenner and Mr. Hall when we talk about what our current economic situation is in this country. But I want to talk a little bit today about how I believe that we can actually curb some of our carbon emissions. I want to make sure that agriculture is heard in all this debate. I believe that agriculture can be a part of our carbon sequestration issue. I'm looking forward today. Today is my first day, and the Speaker asked me to serve on this committee. While I'm not an expert in energy issues, I do want to be a part of the solution. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman very much, and whether it be solar or wind or fossil fuels or agriculture, Colorado, in a lot of ways, is a microcosm of all of the solutions that we can propose.
If I may just say that in Colorado and Colorado-San Luis Valley, we had up till last year the largest solar farm in the United States, 80-acre solar farm that produced close to 12 megawatts of solar power. They are looking now at building somewhere in the neighborhood of 550 megawatt concentrated solar farm in that area. So I'm very interested in those issues.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. I thank the gentleman for serving on the committee. He's going to make an invaluable contribution. Let me now turn to our panel, and our first witness is Mr. Carter Roberts. Mr. Roberts is the president and the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund. WWF is supported by close to 5 million members globally, and its affiliates work in more than 100 countries. Before joining WWF, Mr. Roberts worked on strategic planning and new international programs with the Nature Conservancy. We welcome you, Mr. Roberts. Whenever you are ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for your leadership in educating the American public and Congress about the threat of climate change and what we need to do about it. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide testimony today on behalf of our 5 million members and on behalf of our programs around the world. As you point out, we operate in all these countries around the world, often with programs led by nationals, leaders in those countries who have a deep appreciation for the context in these countries. And we have an observer status for the UNFCCC process, and often we serve as members of delegations from these countries to the negotiating process. So it's from this vantage point and with this perspective that I offer my testimony today. Conventional wisdom says that developing countries do not take climate change seriously and that they will be an obstacle to a global deal. Nothing could be further from the truth. Key developing countries are taking concrete steps to reduce emissions at home. They are also leading in many ways international negotiations as we speak. For the sake of our climate, our economy, and our international competitiveness, I urge us to follow their lead. I have 3 key points today that I want to make. One is that things have changed. The other is that they've changed for good reasons. And finally, that the U.S. needs to respond in kind both in our domestic legislation and in our international negotiations. So first, throughout much of the 1990s, the developed world looked to developing countries to take the lead in solving the climate change problem. That was clear. Their posture was understandable. They had contributed little in the way of emissions and were suffering some of the greatest impacts, all at the same time that the world's largest emitter was doing very little. Over the past year in particular, developing countries have taken action to reduce their own emissions at home and have been constructive in advancing solutions at an international stage. 2 examples, renewable energy and deforestation or avoided deforestation. Renewable energy standard is a classic part of any country's seriousness in replacing high carbon fuels with ones that produce 0 emissions. During the past several years, as the U.S. has debated whether or not to have a renewable energy standard, Brazil, India, China, Mexico, the Philippines, and many others have adopted their own and have begun implementing it with some success. Second, deforestation. You know that deforestation is the 2nd largest sector in terms of CO2 emissions around the world, more than all the cars, trucks, planes, trains, and boats in the world. bringing Brazil and Indonesia to the top 5 emitters around the world. In December, Brazil announced a bold plan to cut their emissions from deforestation by 70% in 10 years. This would avoid 4.8 billion tons of CO2 emissions, equivalent to over 2/3 what the U.S. produces alone. To back this up, Brazil has made a number of commitments at home. First, they've created one of the most impressive forest conservation programs in the world, creating a series of parks in the Amazon roughly equal to the size of the state of California. Second, they developed a world-class system of monitoring that has few peers around the world and is now regularly reporting on their progress in avoiding deforestation. And finally, they are creating governance systems, particularly at a state level, that provide the resources and the enforcement with local communities to reduce deforestation right at the edge of the forest frontier. Meeting all these goals will be tough. Brazil is committed to it, but it can't do it alone. It will need our help. It will need technology. It will need know-how, and it will need some financial flows to make this happen. The reason these developing countries are taking these steps are pretty obvious. They're very similar to our own, risk and opportunity. The risks that they see are even far greater than ours because they have billions of people who live below the poverty line, and they lack the capital and the financial resources to respond, to adapt, and to change. And so for nations with populations living at a subsistence level, even modest amounts of climate change their water supplies, it changes their food supplies, and runs the risk of severe crop failures. Wait and see is not an option. They also see that addressing climate change produces the promise of economic security and even growth. Dramatic swings in energy prices are problematic for countries with little financial reserves, and those countries who are able to develop homegrown energy supplies are able to become leaders in areas like renewables. Right now, China leads the world in installed renewable energy capacity and is projected to be the world leader by the end of this year in exports of renewable energy solutions. Finally, my last point, the U.S., as we enact cap-and-trade legislation here at home and enter international negotiations, we should do so with developing countries in mind. Why? First, it's a global crisis, and it requires a global solution, just as the economic crisis requires countries to come together. Second, a ton emitted in China or a ton emitted in Brazil is just as costly to us at home as a ton emitted in Ohio. We need to ensure, just as we're creating green jobs at home and sending funds at home to drive solutions, that we also ensure that funds flow to those countries where low-cost solutions can be found. We need to solve the problem by solving it globally. Third, by building the capacity of other countries, we are building more stable societies. We're also building potential markets for technological solutions. For too long, the U.S. has invented renewable technologies, only to see other countries own those markets by having the right regulatory framework and by having good relations and markets with other countries. Last but not least, the U.S. has had a long legacy of reaching out to other countries and solving global problems, bringing our know-how, our capacity, our money, and our resources to help countries in need and to create a leadership role for us abroad. We've done it with HIV/AIDS. We've done it on security issues. We need to do it on climate change. In summary, the developing world has changed as we speak. They're playing a leading role. They're taking action at home. It's time for us, as we pass cap-and-trade legislation here at home and enter international negotiations, to respond to their leadership and to respond in kind. It is in our best interest to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, very much. And our next witness is Ms. Barbara Finnemore. She is a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council and is the founder and director of NRDC's China program. She is also co-founder and president of the China-U.S. Energy Efficiency Alliance. She has worked and lived in Greater China for nearly 20 years, and she has flown in from Beijing for this hearing, for which we are very grateful. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner, and distinguished members of the committee. It is my pleasure to be here with you today to discuss China's national greenhouse gas mitigation efforts and achievements and challenges. I also have three major points. One is that China is currently pursuing an aggressive and ambitious greenhouse gas mitigation program, as indicated by its 11th five-year plan, which runs from 2006 to 2010. That plan includes a goal of reducing its energy intensity, energy consumption per unit GDP, 20% from 2005 levels to 2010, which equals 4% reduction per year. It also sets a target of increasing the share of renewables in the energy mix by 10% by 2010 and 15% by 2020. If China succeeds in achieving this goal and reducing its energy intensity by 20%, it will avoid emitting approximately 1.5 billion tons of CO2, which constitutes the largest single greenhouse gas mitigation program by any country. And I'll detail that, what that progress is on that in a moment. But I'd also like to emphasize that China has reasons for the greenhouse gas mitigation programs that it has already achieved that provide a lot of room for reaching mutually beneficial common ground between the United States and China as they seek to achieve an international climate treaty. And these include, in particular, China's growing awareness of the severe impacts on its own country of climate change. I think the turning point first came in 2006 when China issued a national climate change assessment program by 40 different ministries, a 400-page report, which for the first time detailed the impacts that climate change would have on the areas where China is already most vulnerable. Its water supplies. It has only 1/4 of the average water resources per capita as the world average. They have already seen increasing droughts, increasing flooding in other regions. And just yesterday, they announced their plan to build 59 new reservoirs to capture the water resources in the west due to rapid melting of the glaciers. So the cost of adaptation is becoming increasingly apparent to China. Also impacts on their agricultural productivity and also on the economic development, which is located primarily along their very long coastline and how it would be impacted by sea level rise. I'd also mention energy security as a primary motivating factor for China in its greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, and also social stability. They're quite concerned about the high cost of its unsustainable energy path on the health of its people and on the environment. World Bank, as you may have known, has estimated that 750,000 people die each year from environmental air and water pollution in China. So also the economic downturn as it's affected China these days is going to lead to increased social instability if they don't create more green jobs. So there's a real opportunity here for holding hands across the ocean and finding green technologies that will benefit the global economic recovery. And the third point is, despite all that China is doing, there's a tremendous amount more that needs to be done and that can be done, particularly through strengthened U.S. and China engagement on clean energy issues. But just to highlight a few of the efforts that China is already making in its greenhouse gas mitigation program, one of their major motivation factors is the desire to restructure their economic system away from the heavy industry that is the cause of the largest percentage of their greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact approximately 77% of all their energy demand. They have instituted policies already to help move their economy away from high polluting, highly inefficient steel, chemical, cement industries. And not only that, but even though they are continuing to grow their thermal power capacity to the tune of 2 coal-fired power plants a week, it's important to note that that is accompanied by the shutting down of the smallest, most highly inefficient power plants, so that there is a net increase in the efficiency of their thermal power generation, which is leading to a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from that sector. In the energy efficiency side, they're also closing backward production capacity, slowing the expansion of high energy consuming industries through the elimination or reduction of export tax rebates for energy intensive products. They have a renewed emphasis on energy efficiency, particularly in the industrial sector, focusing on the top 1,000 highest energy consuming industries. And our evidence indicates that they are on track to meet or surpass their target savings for that particular top 1,000 factories, which would translate into a reduction in CO2 emissions of 300 to 450 million tons of CO2. They are putting money into funding energy efficiency at the national and provincial level. In 2007, they allocated $3.4 billion to promote energy efficiency and reduce emissions, and 41.8 billion renminbi, or $6 billion in 2008, for the same purpose. They're beginning to implement provincial and municipal demand-side management programs, which use a portion of the revenue that utilities collect from their customers to reduce peak load and overall energy demand through large-scale investments in energy efficiency. And a World Bank study concludes that with the proper policies and incentives, these programs could avoid the need to build more than 100 gigawatts of electric capacity by 2020.
Could you summarize, please?
Yes. Although they have made significant progress, much more can be done. China's energy intensity is currently 4 times that of the United States and 9 times that of Japan. In order to make further progress in meeting their ambitious goals, there's a need for increasing technical capacity in energy auditing and energy efficiency retrofit design, monitoring and enforcing standards in industry, power plants, and buildings. These are all areas in which the United States and China can profitably cooperate. So in sum, China is working aggressively to improve its energy efficiency, reduce the carbon intensity of its energy mix. A recent study by McKinsey Global Institute indicates that if China pursued energy efficiency to the full extent possible and cut coal to 34% of its power supply, it could cut its projected greenhouse emissions by 2030 nearly in half.
Thank you, Ms. Fenimore, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Lee Lane. Mr. Lane is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is co-director of AEI's project on climate engineering. Mr. Lane was previously a consultant to Charles River Associates International, where he produced analyses of climate and energy issues. He also helped found the Climate Policy Center. We welcome you, Mr. Lane. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Sensenbrenner, and other members of the committee. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to appear before you today and discuss these issues, which I think are extremely important in the overall evolution of climate policy. My name is Lee Lane, and I'm a resident fellow, as the chairman just said, at the AEI. AEI is an organization that conducts policy analysis and research and education on a broad range of public policy issues. AEI does not take organizational positions on these issues, and the views that I'm going to express here this morning are entirely my own, not necessarily those of the Institute. Rising amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere pose, I believe, several worrisome challenges. At the same time, many difficulties seem to rule out quick or easy solutions to the problems that are being posed to us. My statement suggests some ways in which the U.S. might nonetheless make progress. It makes 3 main points. I noticed that all three speakers who have spoken so far have three main points. So especially on that ground, we have grounds for agreement. The first point is that I think we need to acknowledge that whereas there seems to be an agreement, a global consensus even, on the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that seeming agreement masks what I think is a distinct lack of consensus about who should pay to make these reductions in greenhouse gases. China, India, Russia, and many other countries that have expressed agreement in principle that emissions should be reduced have not been especially forthcoming in incurring costs to actually achieve those emissions reductions. Now, I certainly hear, and I've read the statements of my colleagues on the panel here, and I know that there have been a number of actions taken in China and elsewhere, but fundamentally, those steps appear to me to be what we in this country used to call no regrets policies. Well, that's fine. We should welcome whatever emissions reductions occur as a result of those policies, but I don't think we should take those actions as suggesting that the world is any place close to being willing to bear the costs that would be required to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the level that would be required to halt climate change and actually stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We're very, very far from even discussing changes of that scale. My second point is I believe that it's true that the U.S. cannot create a global consensus where none exists. Attempts to lead by example or to use trade sanctions to change China's behavior are likely to be both costly and ineffective. For developed countries to pay China's abatement costs is not an appealing option either. A recent MIT study, the one that Mr. Sensenbrenner referred to, estimated that carrying this principle to its logical conclusion would, for the U.S. alone, entail annual income transfers to the developing world of $200 billion by 2020 and nearly $1 trillion by 2050. Each dollar spent in this way is, in effect, a dollar added to the U.S. trade deficit. This would heap a huge additional burden on a U.S. economy that, during this same period, will already be struggling to make many other daunting structural adjustments. Third, and my final point, is that the U.S. climate policy should candidly consider the likelihood that the needed global consensus on paying for abatement will be long in coming. If so, the world will probably fail to reach today's ambitious targets for stabilizing climate. Rather than striving to do the impossible, U.S. policy should focus on coping with the unavoidable. Adopting a modest, stable, and gradually rising price on carbon emissions, I believe, is one step that we should take. An attached statement at the back of my statement discusses a number of other options that I think are important, especially focused on technological change. And I think several of these are, in fact, even more important than putting a price on carbon emissions, but I think a price on carbon emissions of the right kind would be an appropriate step, too. Finally, I guess I need to conclude with a note of caution. The U.S., like most other nations, has a real stake in curbing global greenhouse gas emissions. But if our good intentions lead us to incur costs that exceed the benefits to the United States, I fear those policies may not prove to be durable. And as many people have noted, climate policy is a marathon, not a sprint. And it's really important to muster a sustained effort. Thank you very much, and I ask my statement to be included in the record.
Without objection, it will be included in the record in its entirety. Our final witness is Mr. Ned Helm. He is the president and co-founder of the Center for Clean Air Policy. Over the last 2 decades, Mr. Helm has advised not only Congress, state governments, and the European Commission, but also developing countries from Brazil to China. So we welcome you, Mr. Helm. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Sensenbrenner, and other members of the committee. It's certainly a pleasure to have a chance to speak to you this morning. I am Ned Helm, the president of the Center for Clean Air Policy. And my task this morning is to sort of set the stage in terms of where we are in the negotiation process and complement what we've heard from my colleagues. Let me start by putting a slide on the board here, and this sort of summarizes what you heard from the colleagues to the left and right of me. This compiles the reductions that will be achieved by 2010 by China, Brazil, and Mexico under laws that are currently on the books in these countries. And as you can see, the red block is more than what we would do here in the U.S. under the Lieberman-Warner bill as structured last year by 2015. And it's comparable to the level of reduction we can expect from the Europeans with their minus 30% reduction target. So as my colleagues have shown you with the specifics, the sum total of this is quite substantial, and the world has really changed in terms of where we were in 1997 in Kyoto when very little was being done, and where we are today, where developing countries have really stepped up and carried their part of the burden here. Having said that, I want to build on what you said, Mr. Chairman, that this is great stuff, but it's not enough. If we look at where we are going, we could zero out all the emissions of the developed nations by 2050, and we wouldn't get to the targets we're talking about. So we clearly need a substantial additional effort by China and other key developing countries, and I think that will be forthcoming in the process. My second point is really to talk about the Bali Action Plan. I think this is a major breakthrough from where we were in 1997. For the first time, we have agreement among developed and developing countries that both sides will commit to specific actions that will reduce, in the case of developing countries, growth in emissions. And that is premised on monitorable and reportable and verifiable action, so on both sides. And it's also premised on the thought that we will have support in technology, in finance, and in building capacity from developed nations to developing nations. That's the heart of the Bali Action Plan. And it's a real breakthrough in terms of the thinking and the way in which this process has evolved over the years. In that action plan, we're talking about taking nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And there are 3 types of these actions that are kicking around in the debate at this point. The first is unilateral action, and these numbers you see up here, a lot of what's here are actions that developing countries are doing on their own. These are not reductions that they are being bought and paid for through the clean development mechanism. In the past, you know, in the Kyoto Protocol, basically the only role was for projects in developing countries could generate credits, and those could be sold to the Europeans, for example, to meet the goals of the reductions by their companies. In this case, we're talking about a real reduction by developing countries on their own that's a contribution to the atmosphere. So in addition to what developed nations do, we're going to see some real action by developing countries with some real costs. I would take issue with Lee's contention that all of this is just no regrets, that will really move us forward. So that's the first and most important piece. The second is a set of actions that would be premised on a conditionality of we will go further if developed nations provide support in the financing and technology and capacity building. And then the third is if we've set a law, let's say China sets an RPS at 20%, as they've done. If they do more than 20%, that could be turned into carbon credits to sell. So they have to meet the target on their own. If they go beyond it, they could market those on the carbon market. Now let me take you to a specific example, and Mr. Chairman, you alluded to this in your opening remarks. Mexico in December in Poznan put together the first really comprehensive approach that would show you what a national appropriate mitigation action, a sectoral approach, would look like. Mexico proposed to set targets for reduction in cement, steel, oil refining, and electricity, 3 of those very internationally competitive sectors. They proposed that they would go further than the initial targets, significantly further, if there was support financially from developed nations to move that forward. And they said they would do this through a cap-and-trade program, a program that could combine with a U.S. cap-and-trade or a Canadian cap-and-trade program on a North American basis. So very significant effort here. And when we talk about the financing, we're not talking about big grants. In their case, they're talking about loans that would help them overcome financial barriers. The banks in Mexico don't have the ability to assess energy efficiency programs. This is the kind of thing we're looking at. So a very, very significant and very concrete proposal for Mexico that could move us forward. I think when we think about mitigation actions, we want to focus really on the 6 to 10 largest developing countries. They're responsible for 80 to 90% of the emissions. We don't really care about Zimbabwe and Morocco and so on. We really care about Brazil, China, Mexico, Korea, India, South Africa. Those are the key players. And so it's a more workable and doable deal than it might at first appear. Let me turn to the question of the United States' role in this. I think the U.S. is critical. We are the linchpin of a Copenhagen agreement. I think the positive reactions you've seen internationally to President Obama's comments, his minus 14% below current levels, is a very positive sign. I think it can have a very positive impact in terms of moving this debate. I think there'll be two tests for us. First test is, what is our target? Can we get that target together? And I'm optimistic here with the Congress that we can move something through the House at least that would give us a real signal to help our negotiators talk about what kind of target we could take. And the second question is, will we help financially? And that I recognize is a tougher question, but it's a key question. To make this ball move, we need to do it. And again, let's be clear, we're talking about help with technology, we're talking about capacity, we're talking about loans and breaking barriers. We're not talking about huge block grants like might be envisioned if you look at the India proposal, which is, I think, an outlier in terms of the real thinking on the table. Let me close by addressing Mr. Hall's left, but he said there are twin challenges, and I think he's right on the money. He said the two challenges are, how do we deal with impacts on our companies in the United States, and how do we also encourage China and India to go further? And I think the answer is very clear. On the issue of carbon leakage, in the U.S. we have two choices. We could either give allowances free to key industrial sectors that are in danger, like cement, like steel, like oil refining, or we could do border tax adjustments, as I think one of you referred to this earlier. In fact, Lee mentioned this in terms of border. He said this is a real problem. Basically putting any exports coming to the United States would have to buy carbon allowances. I think that's very provocative in the debate, not very helpful. I think giving allowances out can take care of the carbon part of the problem, so the companies are held harmless in terms of this phase through 2020 until China, Brazil, Mexico have taken similar action in the cement industry and the steel industry, which I think we will see. The second half of Mr. Hall's challenge was, how do we get China to move? Border tax adjustments is not the way to go. China exports 1% of its steel to the United States. Putting a tax on Chinese steel is going to have no impact on their policies internationally. However, incentives like we just talked about, where we help them with the technology, where we take the CCS technology that we're working on and we do it with them in China at the same time we're doing it here. We don't do the old game of develop it here and 20 years later we put it in the developing countries. As my colleague here said, 2 coal plants a week, we've got to deal with CCS now. So let me close. My final thought for you is, I think we had a real breakthrough 2 weeks ago when the U.S. in the negotiations on a Mercury treaty switched its position. 7 years we have said no international agreement on regulating mercury emissions. In 2 weeks, the Obama administration changed direction, and that completely dominated the discussion. China, India, Argentina, Mexico, all of whom had been opposed to a mercury agreement, switched sides and said, yes, we're on board. I think it shows you what's possible with the kind of leadership we have from you guys and also from our president. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Helm, very much. We'll now turn to questions from our committee members, and we'll begin with the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lane, on page 10 of your testimony in the fifth paragraph, you said America is well endowed with the resources required to make the needed adjustments. On page 12, you said our responses need to account for the limitations on our resources and our abilities to affect the preferences of other societies. Can you help me fix the difference?
Sure. I think that the United States, and I think this is generally agreed, because it is a very big country, because it's quite a wealthy country, and because it's developed and has a well-developed public health service and so forth, has a lot of human and material capital, is probably better able to adapt to climate change than most poorer countries are likely to be. Okay. It also has a more temperate climate to begin with. so that, say, in comparison with India or a country that's much closer, located much closer to the equator, we're less likely to experience in the early decades of climate change really severe harm. At the same time, all of that being true, it's still true that we don't have infinite resources to help the entire world convert from fossil fuels to alternative energy and conservation and so forth. So,
Well, on that point, I'd like to, excuse me for interrupting, but I only have
please,
5 minutes.
that's fine.
But on that point, I'd like to engage all the panelists. Do you believe that it is possible for the United States and Copenhagen to create for China and India in particular, but all of many of the developing nations, the belief that there is a real connection between sustainable economic strength and pampering the environment?
I'd certainly agree. I think that's very much in line with the kind of things you see in the submissions from those countries. Clearly, South Africa has been the leader, but this idea of dealing with carbon and at the same time promoting sustainable development is a key element of the G77, of the developing countries' perspective. And I think they're already on that page, and what they're looking for is help with the technologies and with some of the new opportunities to really pursue that ideal. So I think we're on the same page on that issue.
Roberts?
I think for most developing countries, the environment is clearly in their minds where their food comes from, where their water comes from, and they see the risks of that environment changing because of climate change. So they see it more clearly than we do, because in places like Indonesia, they walk out their backyard, they catch the fish, and now as the ocean's becoming more acidified, they're seeing the coral reefs and the fisheries change in front of their eyes. And so they're also seeing the sea level rise in their backyards, and they don't have the ability to move like we do. So I find in those countries a profound awareness of the relationship between their livelihoods and keeping their environment intact, and that's the main motivation for moving forward. So I see that as a powerful impetus for having that conversation in Copenhagen. I think it's going to happen.
Thank you. What I want to find out whether the three witnesses agree with Mr. Lane's testimony that a global agreement, a global pact on greenhouse gases, gas caps, with full trading of emissions allowances is probably not possible in Copenhagen. Do you believe there is an agreement to be made in Copenhagen?
I think there is. I think, as I suggested in my testimony, I think we will have agreement on the targets for the developed nations. I think we'll have agreement on this architecture of how we proceed with developing countries. So we'll have agreement on developing countries putting a series of nationally appropriate mitigation actions on the table and conditioning that on the financing. And I think we'll see the Annex 1 countries coming forward and saying, here's the range of financing we might be able to put forward. And then I think in 2010, we'll really negotiate the final deal in terms of, we'll do this and you'll help us here. We'll do this and you'll help us here, and here's how what it amounts to. We're talking about a registry where developing countries will record what they're proposing, what they're looking for, and at the end of the day, exactly what we've agreed to. So I think it's doable. I think it's really a two-step. I think at Copenhagen we get the structure done, and then after Copenhagen, after we've passed our law and we know what financing we can help with, I think we get into more of the detail. But I think clearly with the U.S. leadership, it's quite possible.
So it's possible we go to Copenhagen shooting for the stars and may hit the moon?
I think Copenhagen is an important step along the way. I think right now we're seeing these important bilateral conversations occur between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Brazil, the U.S. and Europe. That lays the groundwork for differentiated commitments and the kind of exchange of financing and technology that we talked about. And I believe in Copenhagen we'll see breakthroughs in framing issues like forests and deforestation and making them credible in the context of a global deal. We'll see the creation and the framing of financing mechanisms, from funds to markets, And I also believe that we'll make some progress in terms of framing differentiated commitments. But I agree with my colleague to my right that it is a step along the way. We'll also see follow-up in 2010. And we're on the right path. Copenhagen is an important moment, but it's going to be a combination of bilateral discussions and agreements in addition to the UNFCCC process.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Finnemore, welcome back home from Beijing. My first question is, what makes you believe that the Chinese are going to act any different in keeping commitments in this area than they have failed to do in keeping commitments under the WTO, particularly in the area of intellectual property rights?
I think there's a very big difference between the WTO agreement and the climate change agreement. As I said earlier and detailed in my testimony, there are strong motivations and driving forces propelling China to agree to some sort of international climate negotiations that are unrelated to just growing its economy or competitiveness concerns. In fact, they believe that improving their energy efficiency is going to increase their global competitiveness. And I would also say that there is a lot of common ground here that I think needs to be explored in China's desire to move away from its high energy consuming industries, which are responsible for the largest percentage of their energy, of their carbon emissions.
I can quote Markey, who is the head of China's National Development Reform Commission, that says, our general stance is that China will not commit to any quantified emission reductions target. And that's what the chief Chinese negotiator told me when I met with him in Poznan. Now, energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas reductions are two separate and distinct issues. And China is now emitting more greenhouse gases than the United States. So, maybe the Chinese are believing their own press releases, but giving their track record, I can say that I read their press releases and, I don't believe them. Now, that being said, given the unanimous vote in the Senate before Kyoto in 1997 and the fact that a treaty requires a two-thirds vote to ratify, what we're talking about here, how do you get it ratified, particularly when China is talking about this wealth transfer as mandatory spending, which effectively makes China the recipient of a new foreign aid entitlement program?
Well, you quoted the comments made by the chief negotiator in China at the international climate agreements. And I would just say to you that it's, for anybody who's spent any time in China, you have to understand that China, at least to my mind, has some of the best negotiators in the world. And so what you're seeing is their negotiating position. And of course, I would suggest that they're not necessarily going to make concessions at this stage in the negotiations until there is some, opportunity for reaching a deal.
Well,
and I think it's important.
My time is running out. Let me say that given the last meeting in Poznan that lasted from 6 p.m. until 3 a.m. on Saturday morning, the Third World, led by China, was asking for more money. And this is money that the First World doesn't have. Our economy is in the tank, so is Europe's. So aren't we talking about an academic exercise here? Because I don't know who's going to vote for a treaty that ends up transferring $1 trillion of U.S. money to China and India.
I think there's been a real sea change since Poznan that has been brought about by the new administration here as forward.
Well, I've got a minute left. I am looking at submissions that have been made to the UNFCCC by China and India last month in February, which was after the change in administration. Now, maybe the administration has changed its negotiating policy, but certainly China and India haven't. And I think one of the reasons why Kyoto failed was because even President Clinton, who signed the Kyoto Protocol, recognized that it was unratifiable and thus never submitted to the Senate for its consideration. I guess my point is to do anything in this area, we're going to have to do something that is politically feasible as well as accomplishing something. And I heard the comment of shooting for the stars and hitting the moon. I think that probably the way we're going now is that this rocket will crash 100 kilometers downrange because of overestimations of what can be accomplished. Remember, you do need a two-thirds vote in the Senate. My time's expired.
The gentleman's time has expired, although if you'd like more. The gentleman is a very good lawyer. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Helm, you mentioned that you thought that the legislation moving forward in the House was the way to go. I know that many of us in the Blue Dog Coalition believe that the Senate should move before the House when it comes to the climate change legislation that's moving forward. Could you expand on that? We certainly believe that we would be more successful if we could get a bill that would actually pass having the votes in the Senate before it moves to the House.
I guess my sense is, given the election results, if you'd asked me this back in September, I would have said, right, Mr. Salazar, let's do the Senate first because it's going to be our high watermark. I think the change has really shifted the game so that once we're clear, and Mr. Markey's got the key subcommittee in Energy and Commerce that will be the initial battleground, but I think once we're clear there, we have a good chance of moving a good bill that's well thought through the House in a timely manner. I think in the Senate it's a bit more divided. I think we'll have to deal more with that gang of 15, the members who are sort of swing votes, and so I think starting out in the House makes sense. It's basically a political calculation. I don't think there's any magic. It's a matter of, can we get something done that sets a good marker and a good piece out there. I thought the Dingell-Boucher bill last year raised a lot of key issues. I didn't agree with the target. I thought the target was too weak, but a lot of the other stuff there was very helpful. And so I think you're further along, whereas what happened in the Senate was kind of, a big battle over the pot of money and wasn't very constructive. And I think we're in better position in the House to move first. So I think it makes sense.
Well, I can almost assure you that what comes out of the House certainly won't come out of the Senate, and that's our biggest concern, and I agree that something has to be done. Mr. Lane, if you had to choose one action before all others to further the efforts to address global warming, what would that be?
It would be to develop and implement a really carefully structured energy research and development program. I think that actually Secretary Chu is talking about some of the changes that are exactly on target with what is needed, especially in the area of basic science and doing some of the longer-term or basic scientific research that is necessary to produce real cost breakthroughs for the future. It's terribly important if when we talk about R&D to focus on the earlier parts of the research process that are more basic and that the private sector will not do under any circumstances. The government's got to do what only it can do. That's the most important thing, in my judgment, for reaching a solution.
Thank you. And Ms. Fenimore, given that China is one of the leading solar manufacturers in the world, what do you think we can do to encourage them to use more solar instead of, building more coal-fired plants? And also, are they retrofitting these coal-fired plants to where, or not retrofitting, but making them or engineering them so that in the future they can be retrofitted to eliminating carbon emissions?
Both very good questions. You're right that China is a leader in manufacturing and export of solar technologies, but it hasn't caught on yet domestically. And a large part of that is the need to strengthen the policies and incentives that are listed, actually, in the renewable energy law that was passed in 2005, to implement them and to also find ways to make sure that these renewable energy technologies are connected to the grid. So there's policy incentives that need to be strengthened in China because it already has the manufacturing capability. I would add that it's already the leader in the world in solar hot water heating technology. I think it captures 80% of the world market. There's the wind power is growing 150% a year. Solar has lagged behind, and I think there's a lot more to be done in the policies and incentive areas. And on your second question about the coal-fired plants, two things. Number one, all of the plants that are coming online now are what's considered supercritical or ultra-supercritical. So they are more efficient to begin with. They are actually blowing up the smallest, most highly polluting plants, coal-fired plants. So there's a gradual improvement in the energy efficiency and the emissions of those plants. But also, China is already in the process of building its first IGCC plant, which is going to be coming online in the next couple of years, and they are going to be designing that so that the carbon can be captured and stored. So I think this is another area where there's tremendous potential for cooperation between the U.S. and China on these two technologies that are in the beginning processes in both countries.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Versace Sandlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could just follow up, Ms. Finnemore, on Mr. Salazar's question there and what you just stated with regard to coal-fired facilities in China. I think including developing nations like China in any international climate change system is an important element in a practical climate change strategy that's going to be broadly acceptable to the American people, as some of the other questions from the members on the committee have noted. And your testimony and your response just now to Mr. Salazar, you note that China's thermal power expansion has been accomplished by replacing older older plants with more modern plants, and that China is pursuing clean coal technologies, including integrated gasification combined cycle. I represent the state of South Dakota, and as you may know, South Dakota, like a lot of states throughout the Great Plains in the West, utilize coal power for a very high percentage of our power, and there are some very exciting plans underway, whether it's integrating IGCC technology or other clean coal technology in the region. And as you also, I'm sure, know, the President has spoken favorably of clean coal projects, and I think it's clear that from a practical standpoint that coal-fired power generation will continue to play a significant role in the United States for years to come. Now, given that fact and China's interest in more efficient coal-fired facilities and in clean coal technologies, do you agree that the United States should commit the resources needed to be the world's leader in this area?
Well, I'm not an expert on what the United States should do, so I would defer to some of my colleagues on that.
Well, let me ask it a different way. How many do you know comparatively in terms of what we've committed here in the United States versus what China has committed in terms of financial resources to developing these technologies to date?
No, I don't, but I would be happy to follow up with you and provide
Please do.
more information.
That would be helpful.
But I would also say I think it's important to note that the best way to reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants in China is to improve the energy efficiency. Studies have shown that China can cut its growth in energy demand by half just through becoming more efficient in its industrial technology and its buildings, which half of new building construction in the world is going on in China. So that has to be the first focus, and that is indeed China's primary climate change initiative.
And perhaps you could get us then the statistics on how many financial resources China has devoted to energy efficiency, and we can compare that to what we've done here in the U.S., including what was recently included in the Economic Recovery Plan.
Yes, happy to.
Okay, thank you.
I might add, just to respond to your question about the CCS, China has been a participant and committed some financing to the Future Gen project, which was shelved, but I guess it's been resuscitated by the stimulus bill. And they are also committing financing to the Europeans. Both the UK and the European Union have committed to building a demonstration plant in China, and China will contribute to that. Okay. And in the MEM negotiations, the NDRC had basically said, we are ready to put the equivalent of the supercritical kind of coal plant that Barbara was talking about. We'll pay that part. What we're looking for is, could the U.S. give a tax credit to GE or to vendor to help write down the cost? It's 30% more expensive, just like it is here, and they'd like to have that help on the technology to jointly work together. So there's a lot of interest in this, but they haven't done as much because, of course, it is higher cost as it is here.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful, Mr. Helm. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, that's the only question I have.
Great.
Thank you.
We thank you. And we're going to be going to a second round, so if members have any additional questions, I will be able to recognize them for that purpose. I'm going to recognize myself right now for a question, and that will be just for any of you just to raise the issue of India for us briefly, if one of you would like to add that to the discussion. China is obviously, the issue of the day, but India is moving rapidly as well. Would one of you like to address that issue? Mr. Helm.
I'll take a shot at it. I think in the negotiations, as I said, sort of in response to Mr. Sensenbrenner's comments, I think India is the outlier. They have been the most hard line on the rhetoric about, we have to have equal per capita emissions. They've been very hard line on the financing. They've been very hard line on not supporting unilateral actions. You notice I talked about countries are doing things and not being paid for it. To date, India has done very little that wasn't paid for in the CDM and that sort of thing. So I think if you look at the spectrum of the debate, India is at the far right along with the Saudis. And I think we can expect a pattern like we saw in the Mercury negotiations where China moved, India was embarrassed and had to sort of follow behind China. I think we probably see the same kind of pattern. So I think India is the toughest nut to crack. We do some work in India. Our sense is that Indian industry is quite progressive on these issues, particularly in the key sectors, cement, steel, and so on. They are really pushing the envelope in terms of improving intensity, improving efficiency, and that sort of thing. And the difficulty is the government and getting the government to come around. So I would put them in a special category in terms of where we stand.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the implementation problems in these developing countries. There are impressive renewable energy targets in India, Brazil, Mexico, but give me your honest views as to the implementation probability in each of these countries. That would be very helpful to us. We'll begin with you, Ms. Fenimore.
I think you've hit upon the key problem in China. And responding to what some of the members had asked earlier, I do believe that there is tremendous political will at the national level to achieve its renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets. The problem where they fall down is in implementation at the local level. Provincial government leaders, heads of the major enterprises or factories. And what I'm very heartened to see is movement in this direction as well, although much needs to be done. And I think one of the most effective mechanisms that the government's just put into place is a system whereby the job promotions and actually ability to keep the jobs of the provincial governors is going to depend in part upon how well they meet these ambitious renewable energy, energy efficiency, and emission reduction goals. And I have found that single initiative has done more to concentrate the minds of the provincial leaders who are responsible
So
for
are you
implementation.
saying that in Beijing, they tell the provincial governors you're going to be in or out of a job based upon your implementation of renewable energy and efficiency targets?
Well, in fact, yes, that's not the only factor that's going to be considered, but
That would be the most important factor, though.
well, absolutely.
whether or not
but
you had a
until
job.
until recently, it was only their job security was only based on how well they grew their local GDP. And that's, of course, because they have a different political system. We could not do this in the United States, but they have an integrated political system where provincial governors do, in fact, report to the central government. So the government has the ability to do so, and it's made a huge difference.
But we understand how Tammany Hall politics work. I mean, it didn't end that long ago in Boston. So we understand how the local bosses, if they don't get the job done, might not hold on to their jobs. So do you think that that is something that is likely to be enforced?
Yes, we're going to see when the rubber meets the road, it'll be at the end of 2010, at the end of this current 5-year plan. That's when the numbers have to come in. And there'll be, I'm sure, some scapegoats whose heads will roll. However, the concern I have is that the provincial governors are also responsible.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
We hope.
not always.
Not always.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to refer to page 11 in my written testimony, which I hope is going to be included in the record.
It will be, yes.
Which lists the progress that various developing countries have made against their renewable energy targets. It's an impressive track record. It gives you the indication that they're actually making progress. I wanted to also comment on, while we're talking about governors and states, I don't know if any members of this committee attended the Governors Conference in L.A. that Governor Schwarzenegger held this past fall, but the ownership that governors and states in the Amazon and Indonesia and China and elsewhere are taking of this issue, and the leadership that they want to demonstrate to the people who vote them into office is quite clear and impressive, and particularly their desire to join in as part of global agreements and bringing technology to bear and solutions to bear to the local
So
population.
you're saying this might be a tale of two countries, whereas in Brazil, we might be better off with the provincial governors running the
Yeah, in
program and
Brazil-
not the
in
central
Brazil-
government, whereas in China, we might be better off with the central government running it
Yeah.
rather than the provincial governors. So it all depends upon where the most committed public officials are within the nation structure. But at the end of the day, we don't care what their governmental structure is as long as there's a measurable improvement in their production of renewables and their energy efficiency. Mr. Lane, I'm going to give you 1 minute to answer, then I'm going to turn to Mr. Cleaver, and then I'll come back and follow up on my questions. Mr. Lane.
I'll try to beat the minute. Actually, my impression is the provincial communist parties are actually a very important force in the central government, and we shouldn't, I think, look upon the Chinese government as an entirely top-down enterprise in which the provincial governments are operating at the behest of the central government. That's why some of the 5-year plan targets in the past about restraining heavy industries growth have not been implemented because the provincial governments have simply overruled the central government.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. I think, Mr. Helm, you made the comment that there were, and Mr. Roberts as well, steps needed before Copenhagen, and that's down the road. But inevitably, there's going to be a lot of talk here about how we cap emissions, and there are all kinds of opinions on it. The ranking member mentioned, as he often does, cap and tax. I am intrigued by a concept that I've not heard a lot about, and it's cap and dividend. Are any of you familiar with this system? And I'd like your reaction to it, if you're familiar with it.
I think this goes to the heart of Mr. Obama's budget proposal of last week, where he's basically saying we will auction all the allowances, and then we'll recycle that revenue in the form of paying for the middle income tax cut, perhaps assisting poor people in terms of paying their electric bills and that sort of thing. And so I think that's the heart of it, and it's very intriguing because you look at it from an economic standpoint. The way to reduce the overall cost of climate regulation, the best way, is to recycle the money and use it as tax shifting to eliminate more distortionary taxes. It could cut the cost by 50%, so we get more environmental bang for our buck by doing a portion of that. So I think that's what we're talking about, the idea of putting it back through the tax code and taking now, obviously we've got other needs, we got some key energy technologies we want to see developed and so on, so it's not like do all of it, but I think the administration's starting by saying that's where they'd like to go, a small pieces for technology and a small pieces for the poor, which is important, but I think it's an opening bid. But I think the idea is a very intriguing one, and one that makes it possible to do more in terms of the climate target for less, which is, of course, we want to do in today's economic context.
But essentially, we would be giving permits to pollute, and there are those who would say that when those permits to pollute are granted, that many businesses will just consider that the cost of doing business, and that we don't inhibit their or prohibit their ability to emit greenhouse gases because they just pay for it and continue. Do you think that's realistic, or do you think that, and maybe the tough economic times today would also have an impact on businesses where they would be a little hesitant about creating another cost of doing business?
Well, remember, when you this auction idea, you're basically setting a cap, which requires, in his case, he's saying 14% reduction below 2005 levels, the President's proposal. So we're going to cap the total amount that pollution that's allowed, and we're only going to sell permits up to that level of cap. So we're going to get a significant emission reduction. We're not going to let them buy as many as they want and then pollute to their heart's delight. We're basically saying we're setting that cap, and wherever you set the cap determines the environmental results. So I think it has both in it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Hello, thank you. I'm sorry I've just been able to join you, and you may have talked about this, but I would just like your thoughts on what we should ask China on either a bilateral or multilateral agreement. So the two questions I have is, should we address a bilateral agreement with China? And second, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, what is a realistic request of China? Is it an intensity number of CO2 in their economy? Is it an investment number? Is it a CAFE number? Is it a combination of those things? And I'd appreciate any and all of your thoughts on those subjects.
Referring to Barbara, but she wants me to go first. My sense is that China, in their climate plan of April last year, laid out reductions they would achieve in various sectors. I think they're very focused on sector-based rather than national targets. So we'll do this in cement, we'll do this in steel, we'll do this in electricity, we'll do this in oil refining. And I think that's what we should look for. And I think what China talks about all the time is doing this via technology. So in a 5-year plan, they've said to us, all right, you want us to make reductions in cement? We could do so many pounds of carbon per ton of cement. But we would rather say, in 2020, 80% of our plants will have waste heat recirculation. 70% will blend the cement with waste, slag and that sort of thing. 40% will do these other. So putting this in terms of technology is what China really understands and really relates to. Their negotiators say to me, setting that emission target, well, if there's a lot of growth, we'll have a lot of new plants, the intensity will improve. If the economy tanks like it's doing now, we'll build less new plants and we'll do worse in terms of intensity targets. So we're not sure we can get to that emission number, but we can confidently say to you, we can do this much of this technology, this much, or its equivalent, this much of that technology. So I think the discussion with China really needs to be, it has to be about how big is this, is it substantial, is it material, in terms of total reductions, but in the specifics of help with technologies. That's, if you look at their submissions and their talk in the debate, that's where they're focused. They see this as the piece that's missing. The CDM doesn't help them build new innovative technologies, it just pays for today's technology. And they're after that next round, as Barbara was saying, that improves their efficiency and makes them more competitive.
I do agree with that, and I'd just like to add 2 more points. One is that there's a tremendous amount of mistrust that has grown up between the 2 countries over the years on this issue. And I believe there's a lot that can be done both within and outside the context of the international climate negotiations to help prepare for Copenhagen between the U.S. and China, which together account for 40% of all CO2 emissions in the world. So we have developed a set of recommendations for how to strengthen the U.S.-China climate engagement. That includes both suggestions for how the 2 countries should focus their bilateral discussions on to come up with common ground on some of the key sticking points in the international climate negotiations, such as the financial mechanisms and the technology transfers. But I also suggest, and this is, I think, very much in line with Secretary Clinton's statements on her trip to Beijing recently, which is there's tremendous opportunity here for bilateral cooperation on clean energy in particular. And this has 2 effects. One is that it can help to reduce the amount of mistrust that has built up. I think it can provide economic benefits for both countries. And most importantly, no matter what agreement is reached at Copenhagen, you're going to have this implementation problem. in China and other developing countries, and whatever bilateral efforts that you jumpstart right now are going to help jumpstart the implementation process. And I believe there's a lot that can be done at a very low cost to the United States in helping to provide technical assistance to China, and that's the key area that should be explored now.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question. I'll take your answer, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Lane, in writing if I can. Got limited time here. Should there be an international research and development coalition or entity that is funded by the countries of the world? Should there be one unified, which will not be the exclusive place for an R&D, but should there be sort of one institute that we all contribute to generate new technologies in this regard? Maybe Mr. Roberts and Mr. Lane, if you have thoughts that.
Yes.
Not necessarily. I believe that there needs to be some mechanisms for developing new technologies. Does there need to be one institute that drives that? I'm not so sure. I believe what we've seen in bilateral negotiations between countries are a wealth of possibilities for cooperation between the U.S. and China, U.S. and India, U.S. and Brazil. Does all of that need to be centralized? I'm not so sure. What we do need to do is make sure that we reach economies of scale and ensure the fastest possible transfer of technology so we're not all trying to reinvent the same wheel at the same time.
Mr. Lane, did you want to?
I just wanted to say, as I interpreted your question, sir, you were not you were indeed saying the opposite, that it didn't have to be the only vehicle, but just that there should be some.
Right, just with the chairman's permission. I mean, Senator Voinovich asked Tony Blair this question the other day, and to me, there's a certain maybe romantic attraction to this idea that we're going to have some joint global R&D program, and maybe it's only 1% of our entire national R&D budgets, but to me there is a certain charm of the world uniting in an R&D project, even if it's just a small portion of our sort of global research budget. It's just one congressman speaking.
There is no question from our perspective that the more the world can come together and bring technology and finance to bear on these issues in a focused way, the better. And so there will be opportunities, in fact, an imperative for us to take a cooperative, consolidated approach. And it will mean creating some new global institutions along the lines of what you described.
When you think how we eradicated smallpox and how we've done some of these others, these were globally unified efforts. And they were not exclusive, but they were unified. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, if I could follow up on Mr. Inslee's question, go to you, Ms. Fenimore. China just passed the new stimulus package.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about how much money they put into energy and environment, and if you know how much they put into research in that subject, because all of these global stimulus packages are constructed differently, but it would be interesting, I think, for us to understand what China did in this one particular field.
I'd be happy to. So last November, China passed or announced a stimulus package equaling 4 trillion renminbi, which is equivalent to about 600 billion, almost $600 billion U.S. It's a 2-year program. It spreads out over 10 sectors. And we have, there's a big discussion this week, actually, it's the annual meeting of the National People's Congress, so there's a big debate on whether or not it should be expanded. So we could be hearing from the Premier on Thursday when he announces the National People's Congress. He may actually expand the stimulus package. Almost all of this 4 trillion renminbi is for infrastructure construction, particularly railways, which as opposed to developing its highway system, which also gets a lot of funds, but not that much, is good in general for mass transit purposes, for reducing emissions from transportation. There is some concern that it's going to require greater greater manufacturing of steel and concrete to build out the railway system. 350 billion renminbi, or $50 billion, is earmarked for energy efficiency and environmental protection projects specifically. But I would argue that there is an opportunity here for China to spend a lot of the remaining parts of its stimulus package in a way that is going to promote sustainable development and reduce emissions. In particular, a lot of the money, 1 trillion renminbi, is going to go towards
How much is that again?
Divide by 7. Yeah, will go towards reducing or rehabilitating the areas devastated by the earthquake. In other words, building. And if China puts environmental criteria on this building, it could go a long way in reducing its
Let me go to Mr. Roberts.
So recently a report issued by HSBC Global Research compared stimulus packages across many countries and looked at what percentage of the overall stimulus package was devoted to a low-carbon economy. And while it praised the United States for the efforts toward a green economy, it evaluated our package and determined about 12% of our package is going to a low-carbon economy. By contrast, about 38% of the Chinese stimulus package, by the same definition, is going toward a low-carbon economy. So it's much more oriented toward the things we're talking about.
So you're saying that 12% of 800 billion is going to a low-carbon economy, but 37% of 600 billion is going to a low-carbon economy?
According to the HSBC Global Research Study.
And who are they again?
HSBC is a global bank. It's a consumer bank out of London and has taken a keen interest in these issues because they're a consumer-based bank with branches throughout China and Europe and
Thank you.
the world.
And there's a measure on energy efficiency in China that caught my attention. It's the Top 1,000 program. Could any of you elaborate on that program, how it works and how effective it is? Mr. Helm or Ms. Fenimore?
I think that's the same one that she was referring to in her testimony, the energy efficiency program. And my recollection is the data, they wanted 4% a year, and in the first year they got like 1.2, but in the last 2 years, 2007, 2008, we're close. We were just under 4 in 2007 and over 4 in 2008. So well on track, and as Barbara indicated, this is 300 million tons a year, very significant.
Well, just as Mr. Helm said that we can reach a global climate initiative by focusing on just 5 or 6 developing countries, China has found that it can go a long way towards achieving its ambitious energy efficiency goals by focusing on just 1,000 factories. And that's what this Top 1,000 program is. Together, this 1,000 enterprises constitute 33%, 1/3 of national energy consumption, and nearly half of all its industrial energy consumption. They've targeted these plants. They've required every one of them to do an energy audit, hire energy managers. They have quotas, and they have apparently on track to achieve their quotas for each one of these 1,000 facilities.
Okay, can we move to Mexico? We heard the testimony here that they want to cut their emissions in half by 2050. Now, some people might doubt the effectiveness of the Mexican government, given what's going on with the drug cartels down there. And that'll be the first issue that people raise. What is the capacity for the government of Mexico to implement such a bold plan? Do any of you want to, speak to that issue? Mr. Helm.
Mexico's thing I cited in terms of the details, the -50 is their aspirational goal. The President's put that in. They're going to release their national climate strategy in the next month or so. And as part of that, they will have specific goals for specific sectors. And that's, I cited the 4 sectors, cement, steel, oil refining, and electricity. Importantly, we've looked at those sectors. Steel and cement are fairly efficient, more efficient than U.S. production, for example. The 2 other sectors, electricity and oil refining, are national companies, if you will. They're nationalized. They are incredibly inefficient. The oil refining Pemex is the worst scored refinery in the world compared to any of the other world oil refining companies. So, but the good news is these are nationally run agencies. So we have a good chance, I think, with the government being able to take this on. And President Calderon is very knowledgeable about climate. He was the energy secretary before he became president. He knows these agencies inside out, and he's got a real, he's brought them in, got a commitment from both of them to play and to really step up and do some things. And there's some huge opportunities. Example, There's 3,000 megawatts of cogeneration right there on the table today at these oil refineries and chemical plants they could do tomorrow. They haven't been able to do it because Mexican law basically says CFE, the utility, decides what they pay, like we used to do before you all passed the energy reform in 1992, decides what they pay. And, of course, they pay nothing, and so nobody builds a cogeneration. So these things can be turned around. They're not costly. That's my point for Mr. Sensenbrenner. This isn't buckets of money. This is simple loans to get them over the top to capitalize the thing. So I'm optimistic. You're right. There are some real issues there. But I think there's a deep commitment at the president level, and he has the legal authority. We're not in a situation where he has to pass a new law. He has authority to move forward with these efforts.
Okay, my time has expired. I'd like to give Mr. Cleaver and Mr. Inslee time for additional questions if they're interested. Gentleman from Washington. Let me then come back. Mr. Roberts, did you want to make a point on Mexico?
I've been to Mexico 7 times this past year, and I would agree with the assessment that President Calderon is serious about climate change. Mario Molina, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, is his advisor on these issues.
From Lexington, Massachusetts, in my district? That's great.
Mario Molina.
That's great.
And the business leaders in Mexico, most of the business leaders in Mexico are quite committed to this and moving their industries in the right direction. I think there's a real opportunity in Mexico. And you raise the president has his hands full addressing the drug cartels in Mexico, but at the same time, among the leaders in the world, I've seen him make a stronger commitment to this, a personal commitment to this than most. So,
yep. Remember that scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen is listening to somebody critique a movie and Marshall McLuhan turns around to comment? Well, I had a session like that in my district in 1995, 1,500 people, and someone got up to, and I had it in Lexington, to critique, all of the analysis of ozone depletion and all that, and then this other man went over to the microphone and said, well, I won the Nobel Prize on that subject, and that's what can happen in Lexington when you're having a discussion on issues of this nature. Let me give each of you then 1 minute to summarize what it is that you want us to remember as we're going forward in terms of these developing countries. And what are reasonable expectations for our country and the world, both in 2009 and the years ahead, because I think that is going to be the way in which this debate gets framed. It'll be in that long-term economic context of where the burdens are and how they are going to be shared. So why don't we go in reverse order, and we will begin with you, Mr. Helm.
This may not be a popular answer, but I think, Chairman, the key issue here in the negotiations is the financing. And it's a tough sell here in the Congress, but I think it's, in terms of our good faith, as I said, there are 2 tests for the U.S. One is, do we have a real target? Is it strong? I think we can deliver on that side. And can we step up and show that we're willing to help? The developing countries feel that, the 1992 Rio Treaty and the 1997 Kyoto Protocol both said Annex 1 will pay, incremental costs. They'll contribute to this, this, and this. And the track record's been basically dismal, very little to show for it. And obviously we're in a tough financial time here in economic times, but I think we need to think of targeted ways that we can show good faith and move this ball forward. I think China is really ready to act. Mexico, Korea, Brazil, they're all ready. India I put in a different category, but the others are really serious. I think China will step up and outdo us if we show good faith. And I don't think it's about billions. It's about good faith and saying, yes, we'll help you with technology. We'll help you with capacity building, as my colleagues have said. So I think that's the bottom line.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Helm. Mr. Lane.
Mr. Markey, I guess I would say that the sign of commitment on the climate issue is really a willingness to impose a price on carbon emissions. And I would be inclined to use that as the standard for assessing whether developing countries and developed countries are actually serious about reducing their greenhouse gas emissions? Are there comparable prices being put on greenhouse gas emissions? I don't think it necessarily has to be a high price to begin with, but I think we need to keep an eye on the relative prices and to make sure that ours don't get out of line with the rest of the world. I guess the only other point I would add to that is that it seems to me that this is likely to be an iterative procedure. We need to continue to monitor this and adjust our behavior to make sure that it stays in line with the behavior of our major trading partners.
Using your measurement of serious, would you say that the price which is being set in the European community right now is serious?
Yes, I would. I would point out that their price applies to only a relatively small percentage of their total greenhouse gas emissions, though. And it's important to keep in mind what emissions are covered and how much of a country's total emissions are actually being covered by the control system.
But they're serious about the portions that they are covering.
I believe that, yes. Anything that gets us started toward having a price on emissions, I think is a step in the right direction and a good point for further negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. Mr. Roberts.
There is no substitute here at home for putting a price on carbon. All the things we're talking about will not go to scale. The investments won't happen without putting a price on carbon. At the same time, we can't expect every other country to make the same kind of commitment that we make. And it's clearly been established that there will be differentiated commitments that reflect different countries' political contexts. My final comments would be, we need global reductions to solve the problems we have here at home. The smart money is not to spend all of our money here in the U.S., but actually to provide financing and technology to achieve low-cost solutions elsewhere in the world, because a ton in China, a ton in Mexico affects us just as much as a ton created here in the U.S. And so I do believe that smart provision of financing, not just to clean technologies, but also to adaptation through instruments like the Global Environmental Fund, are essential to address the problem. And I believe that we need to create partnerships with other countries through bilateral negotiations and through Copenhagen to make this happen.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, very much. Ms. Fenimore.
I would once again like to urge the committee to look beneath the negotiating posture of China to the tremendous progress that's already been made and the tremendous areas of common ground that exist between the two countries in order to break through the stalemate that's existed for so many years on climate issues. And a lot of the work that can be done should be going on now with bilateral dialogue. Some of the efforts are going on now is to bring together legislatures from the U.S. and China to talk about these issues. Whenever we go to China, my executive director is there right now, we get questions about what is the U.S. thinking. There's not a lot of understanding about what's happening with this new administration, but a tremendous amount of interest. And I would also say that the bilateral work that needs to be done has already begun. In fact, NRDC has been working for over 13 years and bringing together experts from both the U.S. government and California and other leading states in the U.S. on these kind of technology transfer, technical assistance programs. So this can form the backbone of an expanded effort. Just last week, for example, we brought the new acting chairman of the Federal Electricity Regulatory Commission to China to speak at a major energy efficiency conference that we sponsored, and we got this Secretary of Energy to participate by video. And so I think we look forward to working with you as we move forward on these issues.
Thank you, Ms. Fenimore, very much, and thank you for traveling from Beijing to deliver your testimony today. There's no evidence of any jet lag in your performance here today, and we thank you for that. So there is good news of a sort. We've learned that China's goal by the end of this year is to be the leading exporter of renewable energy technology in the world. That's good news, and of course, it's bad news, because that should be something that we're touting in the United States. Brazil has established a goal of reducing deforestation by 70%, and we've heard the litany. But at the end of the day, as our witnesses have told us, to construct a global treaty, we're going to need measurable goals that are accepted by all of the developing countries in the world as well. And that must be articulated in partnership with the developed nations. And the United States, in order to achieve this goal, must be a leader, not a laggard, when we reach Copenhagen. So that's the goal that the Congress has set for itself this year, to develop legislation that will allow the President to go to that negotiation as a credible negotiating partner with the other nations in the world. So we thank each of you for your testimony. With that, this hearing is adjourned.